Welcome to the Dying to Know More podcast. I am Ashley Haugen. Today we are talking about embalming, that process you've probably heard they do at funeral homes, but maybe never really thought too hard about. Where did it come from? Why do we do it? And is it even still popular today? Well, the story actually stretches from ancient Egypt to the modern funeral home, and it says a lot about how humans handle death. So let's start by rewinding about 5,000 years. One of the earliest known examples of body preservation comes from the Chinchorro culture in South America. And that's in an area that's now known as Chile and Peru. They actually created what are considered the world's oldest mummies, even older than Egypt's. But Egypt is where embalming or mummification really became iconic. So around 3500 BCE, Egyptians started using embalming for spiritual reasons. They believed that the soul needed a preserved body in order to transition into the afterlife. So, because of that, the people who did the embalming, which was a very elaborate process, were considered sacred people. And on a practical level, obviously, in a hot climate, embalming also slowed the decay of the bodies. So, what did that actually look like? Well, they would start by washing the body and then removing the internal organs. They would leave the heart in the body, but the brain was removed through the nasal cavity with a long hook. And then a dehydrating agent called natron was applied. And it's basically like a natural salt. It would remove all the moisture from the tissues and it would prevent decay. So the body would stay covered in the natron for an extended period of time. Some sources say as long as 40 days, others say as long as 70 days. So it's kind of hard to nail down like if there was an exact period of time that it needed to stay covered. But in any event, it was an extended period of time. After that extended period, the body was washed again and covered in oils and resins in order to preserve the skin's elasticity. And finally, it was wrapped in linen and placed in a wooden coffin that may or may not have been placed inside of a sarcophagus. And if you don't know what that word is, a sarcophagus is just a fancy word that means stone coffin. They're often elaborate. You may have seen them, pictures of them in ancient Egyptian art. But basically, so it was a wooden coffin placed inside a more ornate stone coffin. Fast forward a few thousand years, and in 17th and 18th century Europe, there were scientists, people like Frederick Reusch, who was a Dutch botanist and anatomist, experimented with injecting chemicals into arteries to preserve cadavers for study. And then William Hunter, who was a Scottish physician and anatomist, kind of refined those methods. But embalming as we know it in the US really took off during the Civil War. Families wanted the soldiers' bodies returned home, and embalming kept them intact long enough in order to make that trip, in order for them to have a proper burial. So there was a mortician named Thomas Holmes around that time who became known as the father of American embalming. He was inspired by a Parisian embalmer, and he experimented with arterial embalming, so flushing blood from the body and replacing it with chemical fluids. And he's also credited with inventing an arsenic-based embalming fluid. And his work preserving soldiers' bodies for transport during the Civil War is largely credited with transforming the mortuary profession. Today, embalming usually means draining the blood from the body and replacing it with an antibacterial preservative fluid, often formaldehyde-based. There's also cosmetic work, setting the features, restoring the face, and generally making the person look natural and peaceful for their if they're doing a viewing. So here's the question: are we still doing this? Yes, but apparently less and less. Cremation has actually overtaken burial in the US. In fact, according to the National Funeral Directors Association, in 2024, about 61.9% of Americans stated that they'd prefer cremation, compared to only 33% who'd prefer burial. And by 2045, cremation is projected to hit more than 82%. And here's another shift. About 68% of people now say they're interested in green burials, which is an emerging option as well. That's up more than 10% from even just a few years ago. Why the shift? Well, part of it is cost and convenience, but also embalming isn't exactly eco-friendly. According to the Green Burial Council, the U.S. buries an estimated 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluid every year, including about 800,000 gallons of formaldehyde. That's a known carcinogen. And once someone is buried, the embalming fluids eventually seep into the soil as the body and the caskets decay. And on top of that, we're burying millions of tons of steel, copper, hardwood, and concrete every single year for caskets and vaults. All of it adds up to a pretty big environmental footprint. So, embalming started as a way to honor the dead and prepare them for the afterlife. It evolved into a modern science that gave families time to grieve and gather. But today it's kind of giving way to cremation and greener alternatives as people start to think, what do I want my last impact on the planet to be? So, there you have it. Embalming, from mummies to mortuaries to a more uncertain future. Where do you land on this? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for listening to Dying to Know More. I'm Ashley Haugen.